Each week, a fleet of cruise ships departs Miami, Florida, for exotic ports of call in the Caribbean and the South Atlantic. Ports of call that are tropical paradises, honeymoon havens, abodes of escape from everyday life, where unattached females go to meet unattached males. There is no awareness amongst the cargoes of frolicsome, light-hearted excursionists that there is only one course and one course alone by which the ships can reach their destination. They must voyage through the Devil's Triangle. This ship also made a passage into the Devil's Triangle. Year after year, the Atlantic Ocean claims innumerable ships and airplanes. Some of her shores are littered with telltale wreckage. But there is an area where the beaches are not strewn with the debris of ill-fated ships and planes, even though it is a minute sector of the vast Atlantic, where numerous ships vanish off the face of the earth, where countless planes never reach their destination, and where hundreds of yachts never return to port. This is the Devil's Triangle. Situated near one corner of the Devil's Triangle is Fort Lauderdale International Airport. Each autumn and winter, a vast horde of tourists converge here. But what about this man, who leaves the plane alone only after all of the other travelers have disembarked? What are his thoughts? He has been here before, but many years ago, when there occurred a most bizarre and blasphemous happening. Things were different then. There were no sleek jets or modern structures. The tower was old and wooden, as were the barracks that housed the officers and men stationed at Fort Lauderdale Naval Air Station during and right after World War II. And it was in these barracks that 15 men in particular were quartered. 15 men who on December 4th, 1945, were scheduled to participate on a routine training flight aboard 5 Grumman Avenger torpedo bombers. A mission that to this day remains one of the most baffling mysteries of the sea. A TBM was a torpedo bomber of medium range that served throughout World War II from both carriers and island bases, and carried a crew of 3, a pilot, a radio operator, and a gunner. But on this day, the 5 planes carried only 14 men. One Marine gunner, Corporal Alan Cosner, missed the flight. What strange distortion of fate caused Corporal Cosner not to take this flight into oblivion? A quarter of a century has transpired since Alan Cosner last saw these barracks. Today, what are the thoughts reflected by ex-Marine Corporal, now Midwest school teacher, Alan Cosner?
It seems that we were to go on a routine navigation hop, the squadron of TBMs. And after we had had chow, why, we were supposed to be at the briefing room at 1 o'clock, approximately 1 o'clock, to be briefed on this routine navigation hop. 2 friends of mine, Bob Grubel and Bob Galvin, and I left the chow hall, went back to the barracks for just a matter of moments rest, stretched out on a bunk, and then for some unknown reason I decided not to go on this flight.
The mission of the day was a routine patrol flight, east for 160 miles, north for 40 miles, then southwest back to Fort Lauderdale. A triangular course within the larger Devil's Triangle. It was 2 o'clock when squadron leader Lieutenant Charles C. Taylor felt the ground give way beneath his plane. Once airborne, Flight 19 grouped into formation and headed east out over the Atlantic. What were Lieutenant Taylor's thoughts as he looked out at the other 4 planes under his command? Was he thinking of the day's mission? Or is it possible he had that same peculiar feeling that Corporal Cosner had had back at the base? But for Flight 19, it was too late to turn back. Fort Lauderdale Tower received radio contact from the 5 planes 15 minutes before they were due to land. But they did not request landing instructions as expected.
We seem to be off course. We cannot see land. Repeat, we cannot see land. We're not sure of our position. We seem to be lost. We don't know which way is west. Everything is wrong. Strange. We can't be sure of any direction. It looks like we are...
We realized something was wrong when one of the fellows reported in the barracks, actually with more than one squadron housed in the barracks, said that the flight was having problems. So I walked alone over to the tower, and from there I heard garbled voices stating that they were low on fuel, and actually something was wrong. They actually didn't know it was navigational problems, compasses, or what. There was a mention of white water. White water meaning actually what? What could white water really mean? Squalls. It would certainly not take down 5 planes in a small squall. I then waited a little bit longer, and the last actual sound that we heard was garbled voices saying that we're completely lost.
Now hear this. Now hear this. All members of Avenger Flight 19, stand by for roll call. Taylor, Charles C., Harper, Walter R., Devlin, George F., Bossy, Joseph T., Thielander, Herman A., Falou, Bert E., Powers, Edward J., Thompson, Howell O., Paonessa, George R., Stivers, George W., Gelman, Robert F., Rubel, Robert P., Gerber, Boris J., Lightfoot, William L.,
Minutes after the appalling messages were received from Flight 19, Banana River Naval Air Station dispatched a giant Martin Mariner flying boat with a crew of 13 piloted by Lieutenant Harry G. Cohn to assist the afflicted Avengers. As these events were taking place, Cohn's standby, Lieutenant Richard Adams, was in his quarters when he was summoned to report to the flight line at once.
When I arrived at the Naval Air Station, all was mass confusion. The report had come in of 5 torpedo bombers that had taken off from Fort Lauderdale Naval Air Station and were missing at sea. There was all rumors running around the base. We speculated on the return of the old German Navy. Spaceships might have come down, but there were no trace of the planes, and we were ordered to organize a air-sea rescue search. At first light, we took off and proceeded out to sea. When we arrived at the last known site of the missing aircraft, we started a air-sea expanded search. There were 8 planes involved, and we flew at wingtip intervals at approximately 300 feet above the water. We had the help of many surface ships, Army and Navy and Marine aircraft in the area, and look as hard as we could find, we couldn't find any trace of either the men or the planes.
Every type of vessel, from Navy submarines just returned from Pacific War duty to sleek new Coast Guard cutters, joined the search, which stretched for over 200 miles out into the Gulf of Mexico to 400 miles into the Atlantic. The search continued in a crisscross pattern that covered 280,000 square miles. But when the ships and planes returned to their bases, the story of the missing men and planes was the same. No survivors, no victims, no wreckage found. No survivors, no victims, no wreckage found. Yes, the story was the same, except for one astounding fact.
We received an urgent radio message that we were now searching for 6 planes instead of 5. Harry Cohn, who had taken off previously in the first PBM, was missing, as well as his 12-member crew. They apparently had disappeared while we were out searching.
They apparently had disappeared while they were out searching in the Devil's Triangle. The mystery of the tanker Marine Sulphur Queen commenced when the tugboats pulled alongside and gently nudged her bow seaward toward the Gulf of Mexico for what was to be the last time on February 2nd, 1963. Her crew of 39 could have had no apprehension as the lines from the tugs were cast free that they'd never reach their destination, Norfolk, Virginia. The 7,000-ton tanker cleared her final port of call, Beaumont, Texas, and was now alone, entering one of man's last unconquered realms, the open sea. Once away from land, the usual shipboard sea routine began. Securing loose gear, coiling and flaking lines, off-duty men lounging at the fantail, the setting of the bow watch, and chewing the gam, the sailor's term for gossiping. Her cargo of molten sulfur was sustained at a temperature of 370 degrees Fahrenheit by live steam passing through steel heating coils supplied by pipes along the deck. As the 600-foot vessel rounded the Florida Keys, a crew member radioed his wife the ship's intended arrival time. This was the last that was ever heard from the Marine Sulphur Queen. She entered the Devil's Triangle very near an area where 9 years earlier another sulfur-laden vessel, the Southern Districts, had vanished without any evidence whatsoever. And like the Southern Districts, the Marine Sulphur Queen also disappeared off the face of the earth. On February 6th, she was reported as overdue. Coast Guard bases from Key West to Norfolk dispatched aircraft and surface vessels in a systematic search extending from the eastern Gulf of Mexico to beyond the Virginia Capes. Each sighting of a T-2 tanker, such as the Marine Sulphur Queen, was investigated. ship after ship was checked out, but none proved to be the doomed tanker. In June 1969, at a deposition hearing in New York, a retired sea captain, George H. Grant, theorized that the tanker had encountered a freak giant wave, rolled over, and sank. But did the Marine Sulphur Queen go down? A more presumable theory is that she went up. Coast Guard investigators discovered that before she vanished, she was plagued by a series of fires in the insulation chambers between the sulfur tanks. Could fire have broken out aboard the ship again? Could a panic situation have ensued at the thought of fighting fire and explosion at sea? Could those who attempted to fight the fire have become overwhelmed by the toxic sulfur fumes? Sulfur fumes that could have radiated throughout the vessel by way of the air ducts and ventilators, overcoming all hands, including the radio operator, even before a distress signal could be transmitted. Could the Marine Sulphur Queen have become so disseminated in sulfur fumes that she became a floating bomb? And when the cold seawater came into contact with the molten sulfur, shortly after the Marine Sulphur Queen was listed as missing, Miami boat builder John Almond and his son were driftwood hunting on Key Biscayne, Florida, a short distance from where President Nixon's winter White House is located.
As we walked along, suddenly we saw this bird in the water, semi-afloat and semi-up on the beach. My son ran over to it. He saw immediately that it had most of the letters of the words Marine Sulphur Queen on her. So we turned the boat over and could see that the back had been blackened and burned, but that the front of the board where the letters were relatively untouched, and so we speculated that it had been blown off with some force from the bridge of the Marine Sulphur Queen.
A remarkable number of incidents in the Devil's Triangle have occurred during the Christmas holiday season, presumably a time of joy and merriment. One of the more occult occurrences concerned a Christmas-time flight of a DC-3 airliner. Ideal flying conditions prevailed as the plane took off from San Juan, Puerto Rico, her destination, Miami, Florida. A 1,000-mile flight that was scheduled to land just before dawn was under the command of Captain Robert Lindquist of Fort Myers, Florida. Aboard were 32 passengers, including 2 babies, in addition to her crew of 3. Laughter and joy filled the cabin. "We're all singing Christmas carols," radioed Captain Lindquist. At 4:13 a.m., minutes before she was due to land, the plane radioed, "We're approaching field, only 50 miles south of Miami. All's well. We'll stand by for landing instructions. We can see the lights of Miami now." The tower operator acknowledged the message, but he received no reply to his landing instructions. The plane and all 35 aboard her had vanished within sight of Miami. Her last reported position was over water no more than 20 feet deep. And it was during the 1967 Christmas season that there befell another chapter to the Devil's Triangle. Dan Burak, a Miami Beach hotel owner, invited his good friend, Father Patrick Horgan, a Catholic priest from Fort Lauderdale, aboard his cabin cruiser to behold the Christmas lights of Miami from a mile out at sea, a mile that was to stretch into infinity. At 9 p.m., Miami Coast Guard received a message from Burak that his boat had struck a submerged object. At 9:03, a Coast Guard crew was on its way to assist. These were men who knew these waters like the back of their hands. They were professionals. Meanwhile, the two men, knowing their boat was unsinkable due to built-in flotation chambers, had little to do but watch the lights from the vicinity of buoy number 7, 1 mile off Miami Beach. Burac's original 9 p.m. call to the Coast Guard was the only communication received from him. There were other boats out that night, but apparently none heard or responded to the call for assistance. Unaware that they'd be spending their Christmas searching for a missing boat, the Coast Guardsmen reached the location given by Burac, but found only the buoy marking the ship channel into the harbor. There was no sign of the disabled boat or its occupants. Even though the missing boat was last heard of in an area lit by the glow of lights from Miami Beach, she was still in the Devil's Triangle. After the search was called off, a Coast Guard spokesman said, "We presume they are missing, but not lost at sea." And missing they were. Father Patrick Horgan, Dam Burac, and a 23-foot cabin cruiser that lived up to its name, Witchcraft. Traditionally, the breaking of a bottle of champagne against the bow of a new vessel as she is about to be launched assures her of good luck and fair sailing. It was a gala occasion when publisher Harvey Conover launched his new boat, Revenock, at Mamaroneck, New York. The event was attended by sailing enthusiasts from all parts of New England. For Revenock was going to be the boat to beat during the upcoming racing season. She was designed for racing on the high seas in all weather, and there were few skippers more able than Harvey Conover. After a summer of successful competition in her home waters, the Revenock was brought to Florida, where these actual films of the Conovers were taken aboard her. After spending a joyous Christmas in Key West, Harvey Conover, his wife, daughter, and son-in-law set sail for Miami, 150 miles to the north, a course on which they would always be in sight of land. But nevertheless, it was still 150 miles in the Devil's Triangle. As the year 1957 was ending, a massive search was beginning, for Revenock had vanished. Another offshore sailor of great acclaim is Richard Bertram, world-renowned yacht builder and a personal friend of Harvey Conover.
There's so many things that could have happened. I've heard a number of people come up with a theory that she had to be run down by a vessel because Harvey Conover was too good a sailor to have a yacht lost. But there can come conditions that can be too much for the best of sailors. There can be freak waves, there can be failure of the best of equipment. The human element, Harvey was short-handed in this passage from Key West to Miami. Under the severe conditions, they could have gotten just too tired. There's so many things that could happen that really speculation is interesting, but not at all conclusive.
On January 29, 1948, a British South American Airways Tudor 4 airliner, the Star Tiger, was en route from London to Kingston, Jamaica, with a stop scheduled at Bermuda. 1 hour before she was due to land, her pilot, Captain D. Colby, made a routine radio communication to Bermuda Tower. Nothing in the message indicated trouble, but the airliner had penetrated the Devil's Triangle. The Star Tiger, her crew of 6, and the 25 passengers were never heard from again. They had vanished without any trace whatsoever. Less than a year later, on January 17th, 1949, another British South American Airways liner, the Star Ariel, soared skyward at 7:42 a.m. from Kindley Field, Bermuda, with a crew of 4 and 20 passengers, bound from London to Kingston, Jamaica. A short time later, her pilot, Captain J.C. McPhee, radioed that the 4-engine Tudor 4 had reached cruising altitude and was switching radio frequency to Kingston. On duty as air controller at Bermuda Tower that day was Henry White, who now, 2 decades later, is an oceanographer at Nova University Oceanographic Laboratory.
It wasn't until about a half hour after the Tudor 4 left the runway in Bermuda that we were alerted that there was a possible aircraft disappearance. It could have been a communications failure. The British Cable and Wireless, who handled the commercial aircraft after they left the Air Force control zone, notified us that they could no longer receive the Tudor 4. We attempted to contact it on our military frequencies, but without success.
Once again, as ideal flying weather prevailed in the Devil's Triangle, another airplane without any illusion of distress flew off into the unknown. The history of Japanese seafaring is adulterated with legends of sea monsters, demons, and ghost ships. But the seas of Japan are a great distance from the Devil's Triangle. The crew of the freighter Raifuku Maru no doubt found it most opportune when they signed on in January 1921 for a voyage that would take them from their frigid home waters to the warm waters of the Caribbean and tropical Atlantic, and presumably on to New York. But as the ship steamed past the Bahama Islands, the Japanese crew found that Madison and Blaspheme also existed in the waters of the Western Atlantic. For the last that was ever heard from the Raifuku Maru was the message, "Danger like dagger now, come quick." Then silence. On June 5th, 1965, a twin-engine C-119, the airplane known as the Flying Boxcar, took off from Homestead Air Force Base in Florida. Aboard were 8 Air Force reservists from General Mitchell Field and an airman hitching a ride. Their destination? Grand Turk Island in the Bahamas. But they never arrived at their goal. The plane, part of a troop carrier wing which boasted no accidents in 8 years, disappeared without a trace. The plane took off that fateful afternoon into what was described as good flying weather. The pilot, Major Louis A. Giuntoli, was a combat veteran of World War II and Korea. Routine radio communications were made as the plane left the coast of Florida behind and headed southeast into the Devil's Triangle. About the time the C-119 was due to land, the tower operator on Grand Turk picked up a strange, uninterpretable message. Did Major Giuntoli send it? What was the last thing he saw on his flight into oblivion? Sky and sea hide the answer. We've told you of propeller planes, but what about jet-age aircraft capable of flying above any interference created by an oceanic phenomenon? 2 KC-135 Stratotankers took off from Homestead Air Force Base on August 28, 1963. These were the first 2 jet aircraft to add their names to the ambiguous chronicle of the Devil's Triangle. Their fate was still unperceived as each taxied to take off into the unknown, leaving the humid atmosphere of Florida's late summer behind. 11 crewmen were aboard the two planes. Their destination when they lifted into the sky was secret. The last position they radioed was 300 miles southwest of Bermuda. Then they vanished. In 1881, when the American schooner Ellen Austin sailed into port, half her crew was missing, the result of an eerie experience that occurred in the Devil's Triangle. According to her log, she had encountered an abandoned schooner aboard which everything appeared shipshape. Sails furled, rigging intact, lines properly coiled, no loose gear strewn about, nothing unusual below decks, no water in the bilges. In fact, the schooner seemed most seaworthy. A prize crew seeking salvage was placed aboard the deserted vessel. However, before the two sailing craft could get underway, they were separated by a squall. After the seas had subsided, it took 2 days before the Ellen Austin again made contact with the mysterious schooner, but the crew had vanished. After what must have been a considerable amount of persuasion, a second salvage crew was placed aboard the strange schooner. But again, before the two sailing craft could set sail, a second storm moved in. When the tempest had passed, the enigmatic schooner was nowhere to be seen. The phantom-like ship and half the crew were never seen again. "70 years before Francis Chichester was knighted by the Queen of England for sailing around the world alone, a retired American sea captain, Joshua Slocum, on June 27, 1898, completed the first solo circumnavigation in a 37-foot yawl, the Spray. 11 years later, in 1909, Slocum commenced a second single-handed voyage around the world. On November 14th, after departing Miami, where he took on additional provisions, Joshua Slocum sailed the Spray out into the Devil's Triangle and disappeared forever. Most famous ships of the United States Navy were assembled in one fleet. Near the head of that flotilla would be the USS Langley, the United States' first aircraft carrier to be lost in World War II. These men knew her well, for they saw her many times before she was converted from the collier Jupiter to the Langley. They served on her sister ship, which, except for a strange twist of fate, might have become history's first aircraft carrier. Their ship was the USS Cyclops. Just as tankers deliver fuel oil to ships of the modern Navy, the colliers supplied coal to the Navy's coal-burning ships. The Cyclops was under the command of Lieutenant Commander George W. Worley, who was her captain since she was built in 1910. On January 8, 1918, at Norfolk, Virginia, the Cyclops was loaded to her waterline with a cargo destined for a fleet of U.S. warships serving off the east coast of South America. This picture was taken on the Cyclops' departure day by a dashing young Navy officer, Conrad A. Nervig. Now, over half a century later, Conrad Nervig tells his story.
I first met Captain Worley on board the Cyclops, and I reported to him in the last part of November 1917. Then the ship sailed the first few days of 1918. From then on, I saw him every day. He seemed a nice gentleman, but it was only later that I discovered his peculiarities. One incident in particular was when I was assigned to the 12 to 4 watch, from midnight until 4 o'clock in the morning. On that occasion, he came up the ladder from his sea cabin below the bridge, carrying a cane, wearing a derby hat, and dressed in long underwear. Captain Worley was a gruff, eccentric salt of the old school, given to carrying a cane, but possessing few other qualities. He was a very indifferent seaman and a poor, overly cautious navigator, generally disliked by both his officers and his men.
The Cyclops sailed through the Devil's Triangle on her voyage south, but not without incident.
So many untoward things happened to this Cyclops on her trip to South America. First, in leaving the harbor at Norfolk, she almost had a collision with the USS Survey. Then Lieutenant Forbes, the executive officer, was placed under arrest in his room. The third was one of the engines broke down. Had to finish the trip on one engine. She sailed past the port of Rio, and only daylight saved her from going up on the rocks. Then there was a poor seaman that was drowned after being hit by the propeller. And then she scraped the cruiser Raleigh after coaling her, causing some damage. And all of this I attribute to Worley's his poor navigation and his poor seamanship.
Could these incidents have been an omen of things yet to come? For the Cyclops would once again enter the Devil's Triangle on her voyage home. But this time the Cyclops reached her destination, Rio de Janeiro. On February 21st, 1918, Ensign Nervig was transferred to a supply ship, the USS Glacier. That same day, the Cyclops was ordered to depart Rio for Baltimore. Minutes before the Cyclops was due to sail, her supply officer, Ensign Page, visited Nervig aboard the Glacier.
He grasped my hand in both of his and said very solemnly, "Well, goodbye, old man, and God bless you." I was deeply impressed with his finality, which was truly prophetic in its implication.
A plaque at the State Department in Washington is dedicated to United States diplomats who lost their lives under heroic or tragic circumstances. One of the names reads, Alfred L. M. Gottschalk, lost at sea, 1918. After a tour of duty as Consul General to Brazil, Ambassador Gottschalk boarded the Cyclops that 22nd day of February 1918 as one of 48 passengers. Among the other 47 passengers were a contingent of court-martialed military prisoners being transferred to the naval prison at Portsmouth, New Hampshire. They included, among others, 3 Navy seamen sentenced to 15 to 90 years for the murder of a shipmate aboard the USS Pittsburgh. Lieutenant Forbes was still under arrest.
When I saw the Cyclops stand out to sea, I've had a feeling of relief that I was not on her. How the crew felt, I'm sure that they would have been glad to be in my place, ashore.
What made this man tick? Was he really a tyrannical master of his ship? Could the thought of serving in a navy that was at war with his German fatherland have done something to George W. Worley, whose real name was Johann Friedrich Wichtmann? Although she had more than enough fuel and stores to reach her destination, the Cyclops failed to proceed directly to Baltimore as ordered. On Sunday, March 3rd, 1918, the residents of Barbados, the easternmost island of the West Indies, sighted a strange-looking ship entering Carlisle Bay at Bridgetown. It was the Cyclops. Brockholst Livingston, the U.S. consul at Barbados, boarded the vessel and learned that the Cyclops had been running at reduced speed due to engine trouble, and that there had been disturbances at sea when some of the Cyclops crew conspired with the prisoners, after which they were also confined. And one was apparently executed. The first Navy shipboard hanging since 1849. A cable to this effect was sent by Mr. Livingston to the State Department. The next afternoon, the Cyclops weighed anchor for the last time and put out to sea. But to the astonishment of those who watched from shore, the big ship did not turn north towards the United States. She headed south and steamed away from her destination and disappeared over the horizon. Captain Worley, his crew, his passengers, his ship, and the prisoners of the Cyclops were never seen again. They had once more entered the Devil's Triangle. An investigation of German naval archives after World War I disclosed that no German U-boats, warships, or mines were in or near the Devil's Triangle at the time the Cyclops disappeared. However, far up in the North Atlantic, a British ship was sunk with all hands. Her name, Cyclops. But there is yet another chapter in the story of the USS Cyclops. It took place at St. Thomas in the Virgin Islands many years later. Two of the Cyclops sister ships, the Nereus and the Proteus, were sold to a private shipping company in 1940. They left St. Thomas in the fall of 1941 for Norfolk, Virginia. Both ships vanished without a trace in the Devil's Triangle. Subsequent to the end of World War II, German naval archives were again examined, and analogous to the disappearance of the Cyclops, there were no German U-boats, warships, or mines in the Devil's Triangle at the time the Nereus and the Proteus vanished. But again, far up in the North Atlantic, another British ship was sunk with all hands. Her name, Cyclops. Not all enigmas of the Devil's Triangle include sailors and airmen, for during Christmas week of 1967, two keepers at Great Isaac Lighthouse in the Bahamas simply disappeared, leaving no clue whatsoever to their dilemma.
This is a very, very strange phenomenon. I believe it is connected with actual change in dimension due to
a magnetic field, the impingement of a magnetic field on a boat or an airplane, a magnetic field which could be produced by a flying spacecraft.
We noticed that the compass began to act up. It was oscillating. It's like you had a strong magnet in the proximity of the compass. And we happened to notice about this time a strange greenish light coming in low over the water out of the southeast. And it was coming at a very slow clip. And it came in and hovered right above the water. And the water that night was very calm because there was no clouds and no storms. The moon was almost full. And the visibility was excellent. And this object hovered right above the surface of the sea for a few moments. And then it just turned up on its edge and descended right out of sight into the depths.
There have been a number of such spacecraft seen approaching ships and actually disappearing under the water.
There's two underwater UFOs, or two things you've never seen before. They've been buzzing along the side of the boat, and now they're off in the front, kind of heading from south to north. So I looked out, and I seen these two things. I guess they're about 60 feet apart. They're buzzing along in formation. They're egg-shaped. They're round, more or less egg-shaped round, I guess about 40, 50 feet in diameter, and the same distance long, a little bit to the egg-shaped side. And I followed them for about, I don't know how long, just watching, trying to figure out what it was. I couldn't believe my eyes. They looked like they were really moving out faster the further they got away. They looked like they were about 40 feet underwater, maybe 20 feet, 40 feet. It's out in the crystal clear Gulf Stream. They kept on going off. As they faded away, I don't know if they faded off in the distance or whether they made a dive down or what, but they were gone.
Mysteries like this that we don't understand, we tend to attribute to the supernatural. We don't like to admit that we don't understand everything in life, but I'm sure that there is a basic scientific explanation that eventually will be found for this phenomenon.
There was a mention of white water. White water meaning actually what? What could white water really mean? Squalls. It would certainly not take down 5 planes in a small squall.
The phenomena of white water is rare, but does occur. And it basically consists of an extremely violent squall with very, very heavy rains and high winds at the surface of the sea. It lashes up the surface of the sea to a white color, and mixed with the rain, the horizon completely disappears, and it's as if you're flying in a completely white wall, just as if you're in the Arctic buried under snow.
This may be what happened to our plane and its 13 men that night, but no one will ever know.
What I have done is, I went back in the past on the pilots, just 5 minutes before they dropped out of the air in the sea. And then it opens, the sea opens. The air on the plane was carrying on, dropped, and the plane goes like that. I have seen that it's down with the ships exactly the same. It will happen all the time in the future. In the near future, we'll drop a plane with 80, 90 people.
What is this wrath-flinging, horrifying curse that prevails in the Devil's Triangle? An affliction so incredible that even the United States Coast Guard is reluctant to make an observation on the matter.
There is always potential danger when venturing on or over any sizable body of water. The sea is unforgiving to those who exercise less than mature judgment. It is really not so odd, then, that so many lives and ships are lost each year when so many are unprepared to go to sea.